the secret dynasties that built Singapore and still pull the strings. Look at that perfect Singapore skyline. Pretty, right? But there is a side to this city you will not find in any travel brochure or quarterly report. This place was not just built on good policy and hard work. It was crafted by invisible hands, deals made in smoke-filled backrooms, gated estates, and members-only clubs. Long before those luxury towers pierced the clouds, a network of old money families was already calling the shots, hoarding land and deciding who got to rise and who got erased. Real power here never announces itself. It whispers. Back when Singapore was just a muggy little trading outpost, a tight circle of elite families saw the potential everyone else missed. They did not care what the island was then. They cared about what it could become. They got in on the ground floor, snapping up warehouses, docks, and swampy lots for pennies on the dollar. Their operations lived in the gray areas, balancing high risk with high influence. Governments changed, empires fell. But these families, they stayed put. Every deal tightened their grip. Every generation sharpened the game plan. Slowly, that old money presence got baked right into the city's DNA. The scariest thing about these dynasties was their discretion. They hated headlines. They loved middlemen. Big decisions went down over private dinners, not in public town halls. Their names were just quiet stamps on street signs or building plaques, badges of legitimacy hiding decades of strategic maneuvering. If you were a rival, they did not fight you with force. They just cut off your oxygen. Contracts evaporated. Licenses got lost in the mail. Entire fortunes crumbled without a single shout raised. That is how the big families stayed on top. Silent, patient, and completely untouchable. But look around. Their fingerprints are everywhere. Neighborhoods designed around their property lines. Charities keeping the lights on thanks to their checks. Laws bent by their lobbies. To understand how Singapore really rose to the top, you have to understand the invisible architects, the elites who mastered both capitalism and self-control, turning secrecy into their deadliest weapon. Quick question before we go deeper, where are you watching from right now? If you are in the United States, drop a 1 in the comments. Europe, give me a 2. Asia, type 3. Anywhere else? Hit me with a 4. And hey, if you are into stories about shadow power, elite bloodlines, and massive secret fortunes, make sure to subscribe and leave your number below. As the city blew up, the power game shifted. It was not about being seen anymore. It was about access. The ports became leverage points. Land deeds became ammo. Banking connections mattered more than muscle. The big families realized the real war was fought with paperwork, not street brawls. Ownership flipped quietly, usually before the public even knew there was anything valuable worth buying. These inner circles knew the golden rule. Whoever controls the land and the cash controls time itself. While the average businessman was chasing next quarter's profit, the old guard locked down assets for decades. They secured entire districts through shell companies and proxies. To the average outsider, the growth looked natural. In reality, it was curated. The families did not wait for the city to grow around them, they planted themselves so the growth had no choice but to pass through them. They did not crush competition openly, they just suffocated it. Credit lines tightened, partnerships fell apart. Great opportunities just kind of vanished into thin air. Rivals usually blamed bad luck, never realizing the decision had been made in a room they were not invited to. This silent influence became the signature move of Singapore's upper crust. Power moved like water, calm, cold, and traceless. That discipline is how they survived political overhauls and economic shocks without ever dropping the ball. Eventually, that money turned into something scarier. Permission. Permission to build, to expand, to bounce back from failure, while everyone else went broke after one bad move. These families operated in a stratosphere above the volatility, a layer of reality most citizens never even see. By the time modern Singapore arrived, the pecking order was already set in stone, quietly, efficiently, and totally off limits to debate. Once they had the keys to the kingdom behind the scenes, the next battle was legitimacy. Influence without a good reputation attracts heat, and heat is dangerous. The elites knew this instinctively. You have to dress wealth up in respectability. The operations that used to live in the shadows started stepping into the light very carefully. This was the moment a wealthy family started turning raw power into permanent legacy. Philanthropy became their new language. Suddenly, foundations popped up. Arts projects got funded, historic sites got saved instead of bulldozed. These moves changed the narrative, flipping the script from private dominance to public service. People saw kind benefactors, not ruthless strategists. But behind every check was a calculation. Every donation bought a little silence, a little goodwill, or opened a new door. That is how you buy immunity without ever asking for it. Inside the mansion walls, things got strict. You did not just get to walk into the inner circle. Information was siloed, heirs were picked young and grilled hard. If you messed up, you were not yelled at in public, you were just erased from the picture. They sent the kids to top schools abroad, threw them into global finance, and taught them negotiation before they could drive. They were prepping the next generation for a world where power is subtle and mistakes are fatal. Being part of the dynasty was not just a privilege, it was a job. Meanwhile, the city's institutions started to mirror these invisible hands. Policies just happened to line up perfectly with long-term private interests. Development went exactly where they wanted it to. Whole neighborhoods sprang up on land bought decades ago. To the public, it felt like natural progress. To the insiders, it was just the execution of a 50-year plan. By the time the Singapore we know today showed up, the system was locked in. Power did not need to hide anymore. It was legal, normal, and woven into the fabric of daily life. The families took a step back and let the institutions do the heavy lifting. The quiet rule lived on, not by force, but by design. Once the cash was stacked, the game switched to defense. In the upper tiers, survival meant being shockproof, political, financial, social, whatever. The elites knew storms were coming, but taking damage was optional. Through layers of holding companies, trusted fixers, and smart alliances, they learned to absorb a hit without anyone seeing a bruise. Losses were quiet, recoveries were instant. Outsiders called it stability. The truth? It was orchestration. Influence flowed through zoning boards, permits, and advisory gigs that never made the news. They flexed their power indirectly, allowing others to take the credit while the outcomes remained predictable. The distance was the point. Being visible puts a target on your back. The real power players preferred to look boring while being absolutely essential. That illusion kept everyone at the top safe. The family rules were tougher than the actual law. You lived by a code that punished recklessness and rewarded keeping your mouth shut. If you talked too much, you failed. Trust was not about blood. It was about performance. Break the code, and you were out of the decision room, maybe forever. They made sure the empire never relied on just one person. Keeping the show running mattered way more than any individual ego. By this point, Singapore was the perfect environment for this system. Steady government, global links, and limited land just amplified the value of being there first. Assets bought ages ago multiplied in value while the owners slept. Influence hardened into permanence. The families stopped chasing deals, they filtered them. The contracts arrived ready to sign. The risks were already managed. The outcome felt inevitable. From the sidewalk, the city looked orderly and fair, a meritocracy. From the penthouse, it was a carefully rigged balance, held together by patience, foresight, and silence. Power did not need to move anymore. It had already arrived. Silence eventually became the most valuable thing they owned. At this level, the elites did not need to expand aggressively anymore. Growth brings attention, and attention brings risk. The smart play was consolidation. They polished their assets, simplified the portfolios, and dug in their heels. This is when a dynasty stops acting like a competitor and starts acting like an institution. Now, control ran on autopilot. Decisions made years ago dictated what was possible today. The land they already owned decided where development could happen. The networks they built decided whose voices got heard. Young entrepreneurs thought they were playing in a free market, having no clue the rules were written before they were even born. For the old families, the edge was not speed or scale, it was foresight. At the same time, they pulled back. Family members stepped out of the daily grind, hiring pros to act as human shields. This protected the reputation and kept the machine running. If a project tanked, it tanked impersonally. If a scandal broke, it never touched the core. The family stayed clean, abstract, almost invisible. That layer of insulation is the secret sauce for long-term survival, and it is standard operating procedure for every dynasty worth its salt. The city kept evolving, but it always stayed within invisible lines. Some neighborhoods boomed overnight. Others just stalled out for no obvious reason. To the average person, these patterns looked like accidents. But to the people who knew the blueprint, they were clearly the result of alignment or the lack of it. Influence wasn't about pulling rank anymore. It was like gravity. You couldn't see it, but you definitely felt the pull. By this point, the transformation was a done deal. What started as raw ambition had hardened into something permanent. Power didn't need to defend itself or offer explanations. It just existed, baked so deep into the foundation that tearing it out would mean bringing the whole system down with it. By the time the public started asking who really benefited from the city's success, the answers were buried too deep to find. Power had figured out how to outlast curiosity. The top families knew that transparency isn't the same thing as truth. You can publish reports and release the numbers, but the real gears of influence turn quietly under layers of legal paperwork and routine. That is how a wealthy family stays untouchable without ever looking like they are hiding. The torch was passed to the next generation almost invisibly now. No dramatic handovers, no public coronations, authority transferred through a shared understanding, not a press release. The younger members were brought in slowly, sitting in meetings where they kept their mouths shut and their ears open. They learned fast that impatience looks like weakness, and unchecked ambition leads to ruin. Inheriting a spot in a wealthy family meant inheriting silence, discipline, and a very long memory. Outside that inner circle, the illusion of equal opportunity was alive and well. New money flashed its cash. New names hit the headlines. But real influence? That rarely changed hands. The core stayed rock solid, protected by systems built decades ago. Even a crisis couldn't shake the hierarchy. When markets crashed or policies flipped, these families just adjusted calmly, often making a killing on the volatility while everyone else scrambled to stay afloat. That resilience isn't luck, it is preparation. Over time, influence just started looking like business as usual. Decisions felt inevitable. Outcomes felt natural. The system protected itself just by running. For the elite, this was the ultimate win. A city that reinforced their position without them having to lift a finger. A wealthy family didn't need to act anymore. The architecture of power did the heavy lifting for them. As the decades rolled by, the most powerful families mastered one final skill: emotional detachment. Getting attached created blind spots, and blind spots toppled empires. Decisions weren't driven by nostalgia, tradition, or ego anymore. If an asset stopped serving the strategy, it was sold instantly. If an alliance lost value, it was quietly cut loose. That cold precision is what separates a temporary success story from a lasting wealthy family dynasty. The city itself turned into a living investment portfolio. Every district reflected a cold calculation: where to hold, where to sell, where to wait. To outsiders, the construction cranes looked like government policy or market demand. In reality, the script had been written years in advance. Big capital moved in before the public even knew what was happening, parking itself exactly where the permits, timing, and leverage would intersect. That ability to move before the crowd defines every serious wealthy family operating at the top. Inside the inner circle, talk was minimal and deliberate. Information moved slowly, filtered on purpose to keep people from making knee-jerk reactions. Silence was treated as a flex. People who spoke too eager looked insecure. The ones who waited understood power. Younger members learned quickly that influence doesn't come from control alone, it comes from restraint. The goal wasn't to win loudly, it was to endure quietly. By this stage, the competition was barely even a contest. Most challengers never realized they were being blocked. They just hit dead ends, couldn't get funding, or lost momentum. The system didn't fight them, it just ignored them. That total indifference was the final barrier, one only a wealthy family could afford to maintain. Singapore kept projecting an image of efficiency and order, but underneath that calm surface, the old rule still applied. The city moved forward because certain forces had already decided where forward was going to be. At this level, power didn't look like ambition anymore. It looked like inevitability. The elite circles learned that real dominance meant staying above the daily grind. They let others debate, compete, and fail while they watched quietly from the penthouse. For a wealthy family, influence was now exercised by not being there, relying on systems that worked without a single instruction. Singapore's transformation into a global hub just made this dynamic stronger. International cash showed up looking for stability, never realizing that stability had gatekeepers. Licenses got approved smoothly, projects lined up perfectly with long-term interests. What looked like efficiency was actually a handshake between old power and new opportunity. A wealthy family didn't chase foreign money, it positioned itself as the only safe place to land. Time became their best friend. While the public got distracted by one trend after another, these families operated on a timeline measured in generations. Short-term losses didn't matter if they kept control in the long run. Even public criticism lost its sting when it didn't lead to any consequences. The system just absorbed the complaints and kept moving, protecting the people who understood how it worked. This is how a wealthy family outlasts cycles, leaders, and narratives. By now, the city's rhythm followed tracks laid down a long time ago. Growth felt organic, but the direction was predetermined. The invisible hierarchy stayed untouched, not because it was hidden, but because people accepted it. Power had reached its final form, normal, unquestioned, and deeply embedded. Eventually, even forever faced a new question: relevance. The world sped up. Technology reshaped influence, and staying hidden got a lot harder. The old families knew that refusing to change was more dangerous than embracing it. So, they adapted quietly. Capital flowed into data, logistics, financial infrastructure, and global platforms that never carried the family name. This was how a wealthy family stayed modern without getting exposed. The public story shifted to innovation and disruption, but the structure underneath looked pretty familiar. New industries still needed land, regulations, and long-term trust. And those gateways were already controlled. Startups rose and fell, often clueless about who decided which doors opened and which stayed shut. The elite didn't fight progress, they framed it. For a wealthy family, the future was just another asset class to position early and hold patiently. Internally, values evolved without getting soft. The next generation was trained to operate in the gray areas, understanding that modern power is fragmented but still has a pecking order. Influence didn't need ownership anymore, it needed alignment. By embedding themselves into the systems rather than standing on top of them, these families ensured continuity in a world obsessed with the new. This subtle evolution protected every wealthy family from becoming obsolete. As Singapore stepped confidently into the global spotlight, the invisible balance stayed intact. New names popped up, new fortunes were celebrated. Yet beneath the noise, the same quiet architecture endured, ready to slip into another era without ever announcing the transition. In the end, every empire faces the same reckoning, not from rivals, markets, or politics, but from time. The biggest lesson hidden in Singapore's elite history isn't how power was gathered, but how restraint kept it alive. These families understood something most never learn. Wealth without a purpose rots, and influence without responsibility collapses on itself. A wealthy family that survived did so by evolving its values just as carefully as its balance sheets. Strategy alone was never enough. What sustained dominance was an internal code: discipline over ego, patience over speed, and stewardship over indulgence. The families that lasted treated success as a temporary condition, not a permanent right. They invested in institutions because institutions live longer than people. They avoided the spectacle because spectacle invites erosion. This mindset turned private fortune into public stability, allowing a wealthy family to coexist with society rather than stand against it. There's also a quieter, more human truth. Many of these dynasties learned, sometimes the hard way, that unchecked ambition isolates you. Power gained without empathy creates distance, not a legacy. That is why the smartest among them redirected energy toward education, fairness, and long-term social balance. Not out of weakness, but wisdom. They recognize that prosperity is most secure when it lifts more than one circle. In this way, a wealthy family became not just a beneficiary of the system, but a guardian of its continuity. For us, the lesson isn't to copy their power, but to understand the mechanics. Build patiently. Think long-term. Act with restraint. Measure success not only by what you control, but by what you preserve. True influence is quiet, responsible, and durable. If this story changed how you see wealth, power, and legacy, now is the moment to act. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone who values depth over noise, and press like to support more stories like this. Comment 1 if you believe power should serve society, or 2 if you think society shapes power. Your voice matters.